Hi, y'all. So I know we're running a little bit close on time, so I'm going to accelerate some of what I was going to talk about and just maybe open up some space for discussion. I love what Dr. Jackson just said, that we try to open up some spaces for what can happen in the real world. And if there's something that I love more than anything else, it's A, challenging history, and B, entering into the practical world. So I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at Stockton. I teach homeland security and conflict resolution, two things that do not go well together. And I think that's kind of the goal of my being in that program. So I challenge a lot of what we think about when we talk about concepts like homeland and security, two words that, again, don't really go terribly well together if you really think about them. So one of the things that I was challenged by with Elisa many years ago, I come from an international background. I work on emergency management in conflict zones, and she said, wow, that sounds really interesting. And then I said, oh, but I also had this really interesting thoughts about a genocide. She said, well, put them together. And I went, huh? And then this is what's come out of them. And so I'm just going to briefly run through here. And once again, you know, maybe begin to workshop a little bit more of this tomorrow and in other forums. So one of the things that I love about thinking about how we can't deal with discontent, Americans are very uncomfortable with discontent in our history, is that in many ways we've built myths of good discontent and only one type of discontent, and if you're not that type of discontent, you are not a good discontent. And much of it surrounds our own revolutionary past. And what's kind of interesting is that what I began to see, particularly around the Women's March and late January, is this even remaking of American history in ways that I found fascinating on Facebook. I find Facebook fascinating anyway. The remaking of history on it is as well interesting. So, for example, there is a glorification of those who were killed in the Boston Massacre as the first martyrs of the American Revolution, as if it sort of happened on July 2nd, 1776. And of course, the day after came the Tea Party, at least according to what many of my students think, which of course was a act of disobedience. And then in their minds, the next day was independence. And somehow the decades of war, other things, the Coercive Act, the response by the British government, all these sorts of things just sort of go away in our heads, and sort of there's this a glorious myth of discontent, and then afterwards everything was great until Washington decided not. And so a good old Hamilton and Washington, the first time those bills came in for the American Revolution and someone had to pay, and they said, well, make Americans pay. Lo and behold, we had our first rebellion, right? So this is something, and of course from this point on, this is what then led to the Insurgency Acts of 1807 and all these other things. And so immediately a cultural myth that was built on the glory of insurrection, the glory of rebellion, of sort of a glorious discontent became, how dare you question us, to the point where Samuel Adams, yes, that one, the beer one, but also the revolutionary one, said, in monarchies, this crime of treason and rebellion may admit of being pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. Yeah, that's Sam Adams. In fact, he felt that the Constitution provided a quick and easy way of getting a redress with your government. Yeah, maybe a little too much of his own ale on that one. Right? So my questions as we move forward and sort of what I was hoping to workshop on. So I work in emergency management. I work in the field of responding to events that happen. And events can be of any sort. They can be a disaster, attack of some sort, any sort of civil a disruption, these sorts of things. And what's been going through my head are, first of all, can we use the lens of emergency management and crisis response to understand the development of conditions under which responses genocidal in nature may result? I know that's really long. I'm really interested in figuring out when we respond badly, do we create more bad, right? And I'll give some examples. And then how can we better understand the evolution of crisis and a genocide eruption by examining events representing the extreme ends of the community disturbance spectrum? So what we're going to look at, I'm going to look at an example of a civil demonstration, and I use the D word very particularly, right? Words matter if you call it a riot, a protest, a rally. Each of these things have sort of their own meanings when in fact all of them are demonstrations in some sort of way, and then a genocide on the other spectrum. So this is what I was going to do, but I'm going to speed it up a little bit here. Just as a hint or a way that we think about it in terms of emergency management, an emergency is an unforeseen but predictable, narrow scope incident that regularly occurs and is delineated in time and space. And the key word here is predictable. There are very few things that are not predictable. Sometimes the results can be unpredictable, but I can't, in my recent memory, think of something that wasn't in some way something that we had an idea of how to respond to, right? So even when we think about September 11th, 2001, the attack itself, I challenge anyone who felt that that was unpredictable, right? That was leading up. There was lots of warning that we were having those. The result of when large planes go into a building that's held up with a metal frame and it melts, that was fairly unpredictable, right? But I think that we have to parcel those things out. So very rarely do we have unpredictable events, and certainly whenever there is tension rising in a community and something happens, things that occur after that are not unpredictable. They are fairly predictable because of what I will talk about in a little while. The thing that I like to think about too is that a crisis is a breakdown of our symbolic or our procedural frameworks that represent a break in our core value system. So when we say that there's a crisis, what we're really talking about is that people feel like their way of life is gone as they know it, right? And then oftentimes that engenders a survival response unless they feel like survival is with their community, right? And very often what we're dealing with is the crisis of the hegemonic societies, a white-dominated society that sees that life way being destroyed with no viable option otherwise, right? And so a part of what we have to do and a part of what we're trying to do is to rewrite that history that shows that as a community, your survival is, right? I mean, it just is, and others are not to be seen as threats. I'll move on with a disaster. Now, one of the things that I talk about when I teach Homeland Security and why this becomes a real issue is that when we look at, and this is one a framework of sort of how a genocide progresses, and one of the things that I want to talk about that we see an awful lot is that we often will respond or identify when we're here, right? When there's a mass grave, when there are bodies at play, when we're seeing things, and now when we're seeing the YouTube videos, And very rarely do we ever go, hey, this is what's happening up here. And part of the reason why we have an issue doing that is a process called a securitization, where very often, if we have an issue in the cultural or the political realm of things, to keep people from talking about it, we move it to a national a defense issue, right? So if you talk about it, you become un-American, unpatriotic, a traitor, all of these sorts of things, right? It's a nice little process that absolutely shuts down all of the discussion. And this is what we're seeing, you know, and the implications of this are predictable over and over and over again, right? So when there is a regime whose survival depends on the inclusion of others, those others become a national security threat, right? This is something that we see over and over again. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was I've spent lots of time poring over, particularly the after-action reports to Ferguson and Baltimore. And funny enough, when I was reading, I was like, you know what, these sound really familiar. These sound like the after-action reports to genocide, right? So I picked out the 1999 reports from Rwanda and from the fall of Srebrenica, and I wanted to take a look at how the recommendations of what the UN said in 1999 still in 2016 and 15 and 17 are still at play, and I'll tell you what, they're not going away because we aren't talking about them. And what's really interesting, if you really want to get down and dirty with it, there are 3 reports from Baltimore. One's an academic report. One is a report done by an evaluation agency that was contracted by the police, and one was done by the police union. One of these is not like the other. And it's this one. But what's really interesting is there are a lot of the same recommendations, but they're put in such a way that the recommendations endangered the lives of the police, and therefore we cannot talk about them. Does that make sense? Yes. All right. So I had some slides that went through things, but here are really big things that come out. And this is where I say, all of you, if you are in community organizations, if you're a student, if you're learning this stuff, this is where you insert yourselves, right? I love, you know, get yourself into these positions. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. First of all, in all of these events, the issue of communication comes up, right? The communication between whoever the command staff is and people in the field, right? And so you need to demand that anyone who is a part of any of these agencies, fire departments, police departments, community agencies, sheltering organizations, all of these sorts of things, have a communication with one another and ask. And if you don't get an answer, ask again. Ask at your town council meetings, ask at your meetings with what are your plans, right? Secondly, what we see in the 99 reports and with the Baltimore report is that no one knew what they were doing, right? No one in the field had an idea of what their mandate actually was, what they were out there to do, and in particular, when they were supposed to use or not use of force, right? So people were on their own, not communicating, and so once again, there is nothing that says that you cannot ask, where are your directives? Where is the policy that says when you will use this? You'd be surprised how many departments and others don't have those policies, right? They make them up on the fly, and when you're on the fly doing it during the event, it's too late. And you can probably predict what is going to happen. Also, the knowledge and comprehension of the scope of the event, even though there were 6 days between when Freddie Gray died and when the demonstration started, it's as if they dropped out of the magic ether. Like, whoa, right? 6 days, however, knowing that tension was rising, that people were talking about things, wanting to know that information, what was going on. These did not happen out of nowhere, yet people were surprised. And those are the same things that you see in the reports of Bosnia and Rwanda, as if like we had no idea. All of a sudden it was like rainbows and unicorns and then genocide, right? There absolutely is this period. That's where these discussions need to happen and need to happen quickly. All of the reports indicate, particularly the police reports, that police need to be trained on rights, right? On human rights, on First Amendment rights, on your right to peacefully protest, on your right to have them protect you, right? These are things, and there's a whole load of other amendments and acts that if I were doing the training, I would include. That really talk about why we're here, where we're here when it comes to things like use of force. Once again, there are historical reasons that sort of have led us on this path, and it's surprising when you actually look at them. It's kind of, oh, that's where this policy comes from, and now I can see why we can examine it now and maybe do something like change it, right? Again, these are not made out of concrete. What we see is incredible concentration on the protection of territory and property rather than people. This is very common, right? And sometimes the protection of people may include things like engaging them, right? Identifying those who may be committing isolated acts of violence, as opposed to going from 0 to 60 when it goes from, oh, we have a mob, and now we have a riot, and now, like, right? There's, once again, this sort of ability to be able to gauge what's going on the ground seems to be something that all the critiques over and over again say. And that when it comes to protecting people, it also includes their right to dissent, right, which is a right. Lack of a political will to even identify that there are tensions, right? People don't like to hear that people are unhappy. So I'll say it again, and again, and again, right? I hope that particularly what we're seeing now is that we need to be attending town council meetings. We need to be talking with people. And if people look at you like you again, I get this all the time at the university, I show up again, right? And I'm easily identifiable. Purple hair's back. And guess what I'm going to say? The same thing I said last week, right? So we need to be talking about the very things that make those in power uncomfortable, because it means that their power is not working, right? And you being quiet, they take as a sign of everything is fine, right? An emphasis on tactical goals, right? There needs to be a ceasefire. We need to have riot control. We need to move. We need to disperse, rather than an emphasis, again, on your right to dissent, your right to protest, and that you shouldn't be beaten. I mean, there's a real difference in the tactical goal versus the human right goal, and you have the right to ask when those are protected. And finally, a mutual aid. These are agreements. Whenever there's a crisis, there are many agencies that are involved, right? So for example, oftentimes a mayor or a state governor will deploy National Guard to support police, particularly in demonstration response. Those two agencies have two very different viewpoints on use of force. And you need to know that, right? Just because the police ask the National Guard to come and help them does not mean that the National Guard then uses the police policy on use of force. And this is something that every time that National Guard is called out, we need to then be asking, What was it about your own city's resources that made you feel like this was so beyond your control that you had to call in military? Yes? And this is really important because a disaster is a condition wherein a community's resources, including their, the people and their organizations, those capacities were so overwhelmed, they had to ask somebody else. And I would argue, particularly recently, it seems like the first call that is made is to National Guard as opposed to the last, right? So what is it about the community that your governors, that your mayors, that your leaders don't know exists in the community that can be part of a solution, can be a part of a negotiation, that can be a part of a community growing experience, as opposed to just calling in the military that have a very different mandate when it comes to things like this. Oops. So this is, I believe it's the last slide, yep. One of the things that I saw that also came out of these things is that as demonstrations are marred by violent outcomes, as they often are, we then tend to talk about different things, right? Those who are sympathetic to the demonstration will oftentimes focus on the police use of force, and the police will focus on those isolated violent events as if everybody was doing it. So we're talking about a violence, but from two separate extremes, right? And we never sort of get in the middle of it. There's a feedback loop, oftentimes that's created by witnesses who will say, the police did this, therefore they're illegitimate. The demonstrators did this, and therefore they're illegitimate, right? So the conversation really isn't about what do people need, what does the community, the individuals in the community, those structures in the community, and then I would argue those who are structured, what do we need to fulfill where we're going and move forward with a particular issue, right? And the more that we separate ourselves, that space for a violence and a genocidal action opens up, because it's the powerful who are going to define who is illegitimate unless you do it for them, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Words count, right? We need to be very clear about the words that we're using: a demonstration, a rally, a protest, a riot. I saw a reporter on MSNBC yesterday get all flummoxed because she was talking about a pro-Trump demonstration, and she was like, rally, protest, rally, and like, right. How cute that you were trying to find your judgmental word, yes, right, that when things tend to be a pro, it's rally, but of course, whatever you're rallying for is whatever is in power, right? So you need to define those things for you and really think about what those words mean. If I use the R word, this R word, right? I rarely use that, if at all, ever, because I think that that's a word that is rarely really applicable. And finally, we tend to also want the police. The police oftentimes want to identify just who their bad apples are, right? And they're bad apples, but the crate is fine, right? And that demonstrators create the very insecurity that then they feel like, needs to be responded to. So one of the things that we really need to work on is communicating more of this, because insecurity, in the end, this is how I define it in my Homeland Security class, which oftentimes blows my students' minds a bit, right? Because we often think about a security as a just defense, right? But when we take the UN notion of human security, which has to be all of these, they include economic security, food a security, environmental, a personal, a community, a political. It's like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. If one of these is missing, guess what's going to happen, right? Which is why events are rarely unpredictable. If you've got something that's going on and there's something in that box that is being denied, you might as well just start planning now, right? Because some props, a demonstration of your lack of being able to fulfill one of these will take place, right? And you have to be very clear about what it is that, what insecurity is being felt. And communicate that, right? Because people will respond to what insecurity feels like, right? We actually don't understand, it's very difficult to define what security is, but when you're lacking one of these, you can talk about it, you can feel it, right? And then we need to take for our communities who is going to identify when you're secure, and that should be you, right? Not anybody else. And who is going to force that enforce that protection of the security. Right? And so these are a lot of things I think that we need to think about, that when we're talking about how do we get to genocidal processes, right? These are the sorts of things that are at play. Who was insecure? Who defined who was secure and insecure? Who defined what was a legitimate and illegitimate? Who was communicating? Who was enforcing that? I think that when we begin to challenge these things, we break down the power structure's ability to define it for us. So, I'm sorry I took a little bit longer, but
okay. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to do my best to speed things up so that we can have some time. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm so pleased to share with you a little bit about the work that I'm doing. My name is Christina Jackson, and I am an assistant professor of sociology here at Stockton University, and I'm on the core team of the Black Lives Matter Atlantic City chapter. I arrived at Stockton in fall of 2015, which is when I became part of the core team right away. I consider myself a public urban sociologist who does work with and for vulnerable communities to develop solutions and frames to understand the challenges in urban spaces and the effects that it has on poor families and families of color. So what I'm going to do today very briefly is talk a little bit about some theoretical ideas I have around morally inferior spaces and problematic people, and then I'm going to talk about the National Movement for Black Lives, how we do our local chapter, and then what we're doing to move forward. So my work has been around unpacking and answering Du Bois's 1903 question posed in Souls of Black Folk by our keynote speaker last night, Dr. Chad Williams, who he reminded of us of what does it mean to be a problem. I've been focused on the ideologies of people deemed as problematic for the uplift and reign of hegemonic European ideals, but also interested in the role that stigma and isolation play in normalizing white bodies. In my urban sociology classes, I teach and unpack the term ghetto, starting from when it was originally used to refer to Jews in Venetian ghettos and as early as 1516 to the black ghettos of today. The faces have changed, but the story has remained the same. Originally, Jews in Venetian ghettos were viewed as first morally inferior, then viewed with suspicion and stigmatized, but still had an economic use in Venice at the time. As we know from other ghettos, Jews had curfews and wore a star to be able to identify them. I argue that this process has created what we see now as black ghettos today. They have a particular use in our society and were intentionally constructed to house undesirables to keep them away from white suburbs. Segregation came in many forms, but we see the livelihoods of blacks constrained by redlining, restrictive covenants, limiting the choice of housing for blacks, leading to concentration, disinvestment, and ghettoization. Today, we still avoid neighborhoods through the use of what my co-author and I call discursive redlining, or we avoid it through the use of applications on our phones, and that's a real thing, okay? In all of this avoidance lies the same idea that the people are the problem, not the structures that put them in the places that they are in. I take these ideas and I add to work by noted scholars Douglas Massey, George Lipsis, and Tom Shapiro about the relationship between race and space. I use this as a starting point for many of my classes here at Stockton. We are talking about life chances and opportunities and the fact that blacks are still one of the most spatially isolated groups in the country. Lipsitz, Massey, Shapiro claim that redlining and other forces that have led to the persistence of discriminatory housing markets have allowed white families to possess unearned advantages from these spaces, but they're also hidden. We have come to learn that neighborhoods have cumulative disadvantages and structured advantages that create very different lives for families who all work hard. Segregated housing, like I say here, has led to segregated schools, which gives whites better treatment, better facilities, better teachers, school and neighborhood networks, then increasing job prospects, shaping wealth growth, leading to the success of children's eventual earnings. So in this sense, this is why I title the G course that I'm co-teaching at Stockton, Place Matters. Where you grow up and where you're born matters, which, as we know, stands in the face of what we profess to be in this country. This is not old news, okay, and very much lives on the way we choose where we live. I'm going to read some selections from interviews collected by Thomas Shapiro out of Brandeis in his book, The Hidden Cost of Being African American. Him and his team interviewed families in year 2000 in both Boston and St. Louis about where they live and their decisions behind moving to certain spaces or moving away. And I do this very particularly because I think when we talk about living in integrated neighborhoods today, we think this is a thing of the past, right? And so what I do, like we did in my G course, is I take them to the actual interview. So I'm going to read you some selections. So this is a selection with a family. I'll just read. Charlene and Andrew Quinlan and their teenage son live in a white working class part of Dorchester, a section of Boston. She is a homemaker and he is unemployed. Their income this year is about $15,000. Charlene explains why African Americans moving into their part of Dorchester concerns them. Quote, "There's a lot of blacks that moved in that I was starting to worry about because I was afraid it was going to go down. I'm not prejudiced, but it's just that once a certain type comes in, that's it. My concern when a lot of blacks started moving in was with the drugs, the pushing of drugs on your kids, maybe getting stabbed or something, or shot. A lot of people did move out because of that. I'm just worried about it going down more. I know a lot of whites moved out because of that problem. I'm moving out, the blacks are moving in, All of them I met, they started selling their house." I'll just give you one other. This is by a family. I think this was Patricia and James Keedy. And let me just give you a little bit of they are white and have been married for 9 years, and they are also living in St. Louis. And when they were asked what concerns them about their neighborhood, they replied, "Who moves in?" James picked up the conversation when I asked them who they're concerned about. Quote, "Well, the blacks in the city are slowly moving to South St. Louis. The whites move out, the blacks move in. It turns into a pretty rough neighborhood, deteriorates, and so on. You know the old story. It seems to be moving in this direction. We're concerned how fast it's going to get here. Nothing against blacks. I work with them. The ones that I work with are telling me that, quote, we can screw up a neighborhood. Discursive redlining and avoidance of spaces because of the people in them is still alive and well. It's not appropriate to use those words outright, even though I think those quotes are pretty outright. But in our kind of imaginary, it's not appropriate to use these kind of words. But coded words still serve the same purpose. Ways of keeping away from undesirable still happens, but now it's hidden in choices we make for the good of our family. And I just want to highlight that because I can go into a whole lecture on this. I'll save it for my urban class. But when we talk about today in a real way, like we brought up in the discussion and answer part, making financially good investments, right, means not buying in black neighborhoods, right, because of the property values and because of what black symbolizes to property values, unfortunately. So in talking about what to do about this, this is a particular issue. These points cause us to question the systematic ways that black lives are not only devalued, but perpetuated and legitimized by saying they should just work harder or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So some of the things that some of the statements that Dr. Allison was making. So what is Black Lives Matter nationally, and then we'll talk about what it means here locally. So Black Lives Matter, for those who don't know, is an international movement about the systematic killing of Black people. It was spurred from the killings of young Black boys that caught national attention, but I want to be clear that this is, clearly nothing new. There's something about the imaginary, the public's attention, and their willingness to be able to take these things on, right? So this isn't anything new to someone living in St. Louis in the 1930s, for example. Black Lives Matter takes an intersectional approach, which is a little bit different than the civil rights movement. It intentionally includes those that are existing at the margins, including non-heteronormative family, trans lives, queer affirming, and Black and brown people all over the world. And this is, I'm doing some theorizing and work around this in a book that I'm trying to work on. And I have said that Black Lives Matter is not about feelings and tears, but it is an ideological intervention into a system that centralizes whiteness. It makes statements about how our nation's institutions value whiteness and the consequences of this in our legal system, educational system, political system, disrupting what we know, challenging American society's sense of right and wrong. What I'll also say is that this statement has changed for me even during Dean Gregg's presentation, right? Because we're writing history right now. And so first I said a political intervention, and then I went back saying ideological intervention. So I'm interested to hear what you all think about that, because it's important that we write our history, as we all talked about during the last discussion, in important ways. As a chapter, we have been particularly interested in connecting the sudden violence of the killing of Black boys to the slow violence on our communities. Black people are dying either way, but just at different times. The sudden violence that took Mike Brown's life took place in a context of slow violence perpetuated by unemployment, educational inequality, environmental racism, housing, and food insecurity, and aggressive and oppressive police harassment and brutality. The killing of Michael Brown set off an explosion that had been building for a long time. I liken it to a flow of hot magma just below the surface. It's always there, building and pushing up against the earth. It's just a matter of time. When it finds a weak point, it's going to blow. So how are redlining, police violence, hunger, criminalization connected? The most provocative part of the story is the sudden violence. The media likes to take this up, starting in 2013. But this violence against our communities is nothing new. These are genocidal acts, and we need to call it like it is. We've become desensitized, and the narrative has been watered down. So what I did is I took some of the, since the first time that I've really thought about this, unfortunately, within a genocidal framework, I took some of the ideas in the 2020 grant, and I thought about questions that we take up as a national chapter. So these are the questions that spoke to me. I didn't write these questions, but these are the ones that spoke to me when I thought about genocide. What does it mean to be Black in America? What insights does our history, either through family, sexual violence, these are the topics of our forums that I'll tell you about in a minute, school to prison pipeline in the US, offer to repair our past, promote equality, and raise the quality of life for Black Americans. So I feel that the chapter that definitely during our 12-month forums have been more of rewriting and discussing our history, and I think we're moving to a different phase now. We're becoming more politically active and making different types of statements. How do our local struggles connect with the larger national struggles of Blackness and inequality? So what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about our chapter. So from November 2015 to November 2016, we held monthly forums on the slow and sudden violence of our communities. Many people here attended our forums at different times. We covered a variety of pressing topics that affect our local communities. We spoke out, we hosted events, we were intricately part of the county's conversation, and with the help of my class, we archived our own conversations. So I'm putting in a plug for those that want to get interviewed by my students to come see me, okay? So November, December, January, I started off with the sociology of racism, and I'll say that we had a good number of folks that came out to our forums. We've had anywhere from about 30 to upwards of 60 community residents that have come out to our forums. December, we held this with Ralph Hunter, of course, the historic legend, Ralph Hunter, on the history of the Black family. In January, we did the sexual and domestic violence panel, and this was a really interesting panel that was put together by a wonderful community leader, Valeria Marcus, as well as Chief Henry White, Darren Palmer, and Tamu King Lewis from the Women's Center, and of course, Councilman Kaleem Shabazz and Corey Young. This actually led to Resolution 217, which made April Child Abuse Prevention Month. In February, we changed gears a little bit. I don't even remember what this is how we do with working with communities. We had another topic that we were going to do for February, but since the takeover bill was on everybody's mind, we shifted gears a little bit, and we were so pleased to have Steve Young, who's the president of the National Action Network, lead us in a civil disobedience workshop involving our community members as well as Stockton students. And I put up some pictures from that day, but my students were part of this, and they were role-playing, right, how to interact with the police. And it was a really good time. I can't express in words. March, we went on to have the school to prison pipeline, and in April, we talked about fair housing with Reverend Eric Dobson, who's also coming to my class in the Ogo Pomar, and she talked a little bit about the Mount Laurel issues. In May, June, and July, we talked about Arts for Social Change, which is another hat I wear that other people don't usually know, but talking about some of the old work that I did on Du Bois and his use of art for propaganda purposes. So we had local artists and poets read poetry. In June, our white core team members led a white privilege workshop. This was a very interactive workshop where we did like different activities. Oh yeah, Jess was there. The privilege walk where we all, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but you all stand in a line and you say a series of statements. And we also had a questionnaire that we all filled out. You know, how do we feel when a police, a police or a cop pulls up behind us, and we were able to kind of, do some good work around that. That was led by David Bowman, Michael Clough, and Reverend Cynthia Kane. In July, we took up this issue of violence. I think Donnie talked about this in her presentation, but the issue of black on black crime is looked at as being so much higher than white on white crime when it's really not statistically. It's like no lie, 4 points away from what white on white violence is, but that's not what we get from the media and the narrative when we actually look at the data. And then for our last bit of forums, Dr. Allison led, and she presented to us about perceptions of blacks in the media, as well as Glynis Reed, who actually has if you guys are interested, has an exhibition up at the Noise Arts Garage right now. In September, we had Affirming Black LGBT Lives, where we had Travis Love and Samia Wright. Samia is a student at Stockton, and Travis Love is I don't even know what hat I want to paint him with. I'm sure you all know him. He's a wonderful community resident and activist and artist, and so many great things. In October, we were so pleased to have Dr. Erball and Dr. Jacobson present to us what they presented today on the health and well-being and the status of women in Atlantic County. So that was really awesome as well. So we've done a lot over this past year since we started. We've expanded our membership and core team. And actually in the picture on the left is Reverend Willie Francois, who's going to be giving our closing remarks today. We've expanded our team. We've made coalitions. We've expanded networks to include nonprofits. And I listed some of the people and the organizations that we've been in contact with. We created Resolution 217. I and other students of mine started blogging our forums on NJ Platform. We held our civil disobedience workshop, and we provided opportunities for our members to reflect on our own privilege, divisions, and personhood. So moving forward, I would describe where we're in right now as we're moving forward into kind of like a different phase. The core team, and I think none of the core team's here right now, but there were a couple members from last night. After the forums ended, we had some work in November around where we want to go from here and how we want to expand. And so we really wanted to focus on coalition building and getting our voice out there and connecting with other South Jersey entities. So we've had a lot of contact with other entities that they want to be a part. We also want to focus on education reform, so talking about history and the way that we're taught in school about slavery and other forms of things. It's taught in this very victimized position, among other things, right? We also wanted to create a stronger citizen complaint review board, so more of a criminal justice tactic. We're organizing workshops. And what we really have done is created a network of people for all colors who are committed to racial, economic, and gender justice. We've grown a network of people that are willing to reflect on our own personal biases, but also have created a language for how to talk about structural violence arising from a nation's institution. And I think this is really important because I think that many times, like we talked about in the discussion and answer, there's this line between academic talk and real talk, where what I try to do is kind of bring that in the same conversation. And so that's kind of what we did as a way to be able to develop a language around talking about structural violence in our country. So that's really all I have. I'm going to say that if, you know, I'm happy to answer questions in our discussion, but ways to keep in touch with us is you can keep in touch with us through our Facebook page, and you can also check out some of the blogs that we've done on the NJ platform. And that's it. Thank you.